All right, it looks like everybody is in from the waiting room so far. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Tech Tuesday. My name is Vanessa. I'm a communication specialist with ITS. And today we have Evan Scholl, who's the Associate Director of Research Informatics Data Science Services. He's going to be talking about multi-institutional data sharing at WCM. Before we begin, I just wanted to let everyone know that we are recording today's session. So if you want to refer to anything afterwards, something that maybe you forgot and want to look back on, we'll be sure to send you a link to the recording later today, along with any other information that Evan mentions. Will all be included in the email address that you provided us when you registered. We also do have everyone on mute. We are expecting quite a few people to log in today, but if you have any question at any point during today's session, please feel free to hit the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window and just type your question as it comes to mind. And, we'll be stopping to take questions and answer any questions you have about multi-institutional data sharing. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Evan. Evan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Vanessa. I really appreciate it. It's always a pleasure to have the chance to present here. As Vanessa mentioned, my name is Evan Scholl. I'm the Associate Director for Research Informatics Data Science Services. I suspect also maybe the winner of the longest job title award in ITS. I've never actually done the math. Someone may have beaten me. I'm also a lecturer in the Division of Health Informatics in the Department of Population Health Sciences, although my primary role here is operational. And what I'm here to talk to you today about is multi-institutional data sharing, specifically, how we at Weill Cornell go about extracting patient data and sharing it with other institutions so that we can do the kind of life-saving research that, brought us things like the COVID vaccine. This is a really sort of important area. There's a real drive from, federal agencies, from private industry, from all sorts of sectors to try and make sure that people can sort of take advantage of all the data that we have for millions of patients across the country, and really sort of bring it together to do these big, large scale observational studies that we can use to draw conclusions and inferences about population health, about overall disease trends, and about all sorts of really important issues that are facing the nation. So without further ado, let me sort of launch in here. So I don't think it'll come as a surprise to anyone to hear me assert that in order to do good research, you need good data. And researchers need good data for all sorts of purposes. Sometimes the reason we're going for this is because we're trying to get a new drug brought to market. We have an IND. We're looking to get a new indication for an existing drug. Sometimes researchers are trying to do like what we call pharmacosurveillance or pharmacovigilance. We're looking at indications that certain drugs might not be safe and might not need to be pulled from the market. A lot of times, especially in pharma, we're looking to find the drug that works best for a given condition, or we're trying to look at a population and see how good of a job we're doing at taking equal care to all members of our society. Or we're trying to do something to people, implement an intervention and then assess the extent to which that intervention is actually having the impact that we want it to have. And you can't really do any of these things without good data, right? The FDA is not going to let you bring a new drug to market unless you can demonstrate with rock hard data that the drug is safe and effective. Similarly, they're not going to pull a drug from the market if there's not any indication that people are dying or experiencing adverse events. And all of your conclusions about the other 3 points here on the slide are all going to be totally wrong if the underlying data that you're using to make those assessments isn't sound and stable. Clinical operations need this stuff too. It's not just researchers. Clinicians need good data in order to be able to make informed decisions. Also, machine learning. There's been a lot of buzz about AI and ML out there in the past. You need a fundamental rock solid training set in order to get any of those models behaving with anything resembling accuracy or good performance. And ultimately also, as I mentioned earlier, to get a sense of which drugs may be damaging people. So in order to do all of this kind of work, you need good data and you need a lot of it. So let's talk a little bit about some of the data sources that are available to folks who are trying to do these kinds of large scale observational studies. One of the really sort of most common data sources that people use when they're trying to do large scale observational research on healthcare is claims data. And this is information that's coming from insurers usually. Many of them sort of work together to pool the information that's submitted to them and make that available through programs like Optum. There's other sort of ClinScan. There's a few databases out there, usually with an associated cost to access them. That use insurance data to sort of get a sense of which patients and populations are experiencing which conditions. And claims data can be really useful because you get a sense of what happened to the patient, no matter where they went. If you're, let's say you're Aetna, if you're an Aetna patient, you're Weill Cornell Care, Aetna knows just as much about that as they do about your care in Albuquerque or your care in Los Angeles. So that means that insurance companies and claims data sets get sort of the full spectrum of everything that happened to the patient, unless there's something they found really embarrassing where they went and paid out of pocket. But the data are shallow. And what I mean by that is that insurers only really get the claims. They get the diagnoses and the procedures, the what we did and the why we did it. They're not getting any of the more sort of granular data underlying that. Like, if, for example, they might be able to tell that a complete blood count was ordered, but they're not going to learn that the absolute neutrophil count was below 10. They're just going to learn that the procedure was ordered. So you can think of it as sort of being broad but shallow. EHR data is one of the second places that sort of people get data to do these large observational studies, and EHR data suffers from sort of the opposite problem. If you think about the data that we at Weill Cornell have access to in our electronic health record, it's really deep for what we do. If we do a lab, we know what the lab value was. If we order a CT scan, we can get the report back from the CT scan. But it's not going to capture care that took place anywhere else. So going back to my previous example, if I'm a Cornell patient and I go to Cornell for cardiology, if I go to Albuquerque and have a heart attack in Albuquerque, chances are there's probably not much about that information, about that heart attack in Albuquerque, that's going to come back into Epic automatically. Maybe if I mention it to my doctor, they'll write down a note, but there isn't going to be any assertion in Epic that says, this patient, Evan Scholl, had a heart attack, on this date. So you can think of it as being much deeper, but a little bit narrower, and that it's only capturing the component of the spectrum of care that happened at the institution that's maintaining the electronic health record. Finally, the data source that people use probably more often than either of these is manually adjudicated data. And for clinical trials, this is still really the gold standard. This is people entering data by hand, and a lot of times that happens in REDCap. There's other platforms for data capture. Microsoft Excel, still all too common. If you're using Excel for data capture, and there's one thing you take away from my talk today, it would be that I would strongly urge you to reconsider doing so for version control issues, if nothing else. But people still do this all the time. And, capturing data by hand is still often, sort of the go-to way to do an observational study. Chart review, if anyone on the call is a med student or was a med student at any point, you may remember getting drafted into chart review studies. This is when you just sort of pull it out by hand and count on your fingers and toes. These data sets can be really sort of well tailored and designed for a specific research question, but they're very effortful to produce. They're very time consuming to produce, and really they're only good for the one study that you commissioned them for. If you're going in and looking at a very specific drug, you're probably abstracting only the data elements you really need, rather than the data elements that might be useful later on down the road for further studies, with some exceptions. The real problem here is that even if you have multiple sources, and even if you have multiple of the same kind of sources, the formats are still all over the place, right? So the claims data might be stored in one way. The EHR data probably has a proprietary model that the company that coded it designed. The manually adjudicated data, maybe you and your biostatistician thought of the format for that, and designed which columns the Excel spreadsheet would have or which tabs it would have. There's no real way to harmonize all of this and bring it together. So what's the solution for this problem, and why should you care? There is a solution for this problem of the data being distributed in all these sort of disparate sources and all these different disparate formats with all these strengths and weaknesses. But briefly, sort of why should we care? In no small part because the government is rapidly accelerating, the use of this kind of data. In the past, clinical trials were really the only way to get drugs to market. And this is really important because clinical trials are excruciatingly and horrifically expensive to run. In 2019, I think the average clinical trial cost $17 million. A lot of times they're sort of good drugs that could be helping patients that just don't make it to market because there isn't enough financial driver, thanks to the way we've structured the incentives in our economy, to run a trial to prove that it works. So under President Obama, the passage of the 21st Century Cures Act, the FDA was instructed to evaluate the use of something called real-world evidence, to support indications for new drugs or for post-approval study requirements, or really for anything the FDA wants, for purposes not specified in this section. That phrase does a lot of work. And in April of 2019, this saw a real sort of sea change moment in the world of clinical research, in that Ibrance, or palbociclib, was issued an approval from the FDA for use in men with breast cancer. And in the past, men with breast cancer were treated with drugs on a sort of off-label basis. There was no official FDA approved drug for men with breast cancer. Flatiron, which is a company that specializes in using EHR data for research, was able to work with Pfizer to use data from their electronic health records to show that palbociclib was being used in men with breast cancer, and that it was safe, and that it was effective, and that it was prolonging survival in these men. Pfizer used the data and got the approval. And this was sort of a really big sea change, because people looked at this and realized, light bulb moment, we don't have to necessarily run clinical trials anymore. The corollary of this is that in order to do studies like this, you need huge amounts of data. In order to sort of show that these drugs are safe, you need data from a lot of men with breast cancer, which means you need data from a lot of people, because breast cancer in men is relatively sort of uncommon. So the only way to really get this is to sort of spread a broad net, and bring in data from lots of different sources. And I'll get a little bit more to that later on in the presentation. But I want to sort of prime the pump and get you guys thinking about the need to sort of bring data together from multiple sources to do this kind of work, and to get this kind of approval, without having to run a clinical trial. So real world evidence, just a sort of quick definition from the New England Journal of Medicine, a much more authoritative source than me. It's any information on healthcare that comes from anything outside of a clinical, a typical sort of randomized clinical trial. It includes EHR data, claims data, like I said, registries, data from wearables, all that sort of falls under sort of real world evidence. So what we do here locally at Weill Cornell to sort of support this real world evidence, is we pull data from a whole bunch of different sources, and we make it available to people through a whole number of different ways. We get data for about 3 million patients. It's actually probably more than this now. At the time of when I first drafted the slide, it was about 80 million encounters. There's since been a few million more. We have all the data from our genomics systems. We have data from the clinical trials management systems, the biobank, REDCat. We run natural language processing to try and spin straw into gold from clinical notes. But we also, and what's sort of the bullet point to look at the most here is, especially in terms of multi-institutional data sharing and collaborating across sites to build these large networks of data. We have these federated data models, that we can sort of use to address the problem I was describing earlier. EHRs, just a sort of a brief chat of the problem with EHRs. They're designed for billing. They're not designed for research. They're designed for billing. They're barely even designed for clinical care. I think a lot of clinicians would argue. They're designed for billing first. They're not really designed for research. The data are captured, across all these different systems, as we discussed earlier. But even within EHRs, when you look at all the different EHR systems that Weill Cornell has used over the years, there's at least 3 or 4 of them I can think of off the top of my head. And each one of those systems uses a different model to store data. And I can tell you right now that the format Allscripts uses to store data, very, very different from the format Epic uses to store data. All of these models are, again, horrifyingly complicated. Epic's data model has, you can think of it as a giant Excel spreadsheet with about 80,000 different tabs, and all sorts of relationships between the tabs that you have to, go to class for a year to start to understand. Allscripts does it completely differently, and any of the knowledge you have about how data is laid out in Epic doesn't really apply too much to how data is laid out in Allscripts. So the data are really just sort of distributed in all sorts of different ways. So again, earlier we have this conflict between different sources of data, claims, EHR, manually adjudicated. Now we're seeing that even within EHR systems, there are different ways to store data depending on which vendor had produced the system. And thanks, Bo, for weighing in on my out-of-date slide. We actually have about 4.5 million patients rather than 2.8 now. So, again, when we look at the transition from, talking about problems with data, observational data sets writ large, zooming in a little closer, looking at the problems with EHR data, how do we solve this problem? And Odyssey is one of the groups that sort of come together to address this problem by providing a common framework for people to use to store their data. So Odyssey stands for Observational Health Data Sciences and Informatics. It comes from an earlier partnership called OMOP, the Observational Medical Outcomes Partnership. The grant that funded OMOP has expired a long time ago. It got sort of supplanted or subsumed by Odyssey. You'll still hear people refer to what they call the OMOP CDM. People talk about OMOP all the time, even though the grant is gone. But Odyssey is the name of the consortium that's sort of keeping the fire burning. And Odyssey is centered uptown at Columbia in their Department of Biomedical Informatics. A lot of the folks who sort of invented the data model are on the faculty up there. But what Odyssey really is this sort of multi-stakeholder group that came together to help people use data better, whether it's claims data, EHR data, what have you. And really sort of three different groups of people came together to make this happen. One was pharmaceutical companies. One was, the government, a lot of regulators and the FDA, and then one was healthcare organizations like our own. And sort of the cornerstone, that this whole consortium work is built on is this thing called the OMOP Common Data Model. And the OMOP Common Data Model is really sort of a way to, address the problems that I was describing earlier. And this one sort of visual that I'm displaying here on the screen right now, it does, a picture is worth 1,000 words. This really sort of boils down the process, graphically and visually. And you can think of these two purple boxes and this one gray box up here that are, headed with source 1, source 2, and source 3. You can think of those as data from 3 different EHR systems. Maybe, one of them is the Epic data that we have from Weill Cornell. One of them is, the legacy data from Cerner, which is the EHR system NYP Brooklyn was using, before they went live on Epic. Maybe the fourth one is Allscripts, which is the system that, the hospital was using before Epic for inpatient care. All of those data, again, as I said earlier, are stored in radically different formats. The shape is different. The tables are different. The column names are different. The relationship between the tables are different. Using OMOP, there is sort of a target structure that everyone has to put their data into. And I'll go into this process in a little bit more detail in a moment. But by mapping your data to this format, you can achieve this sort of harmonized, homogeneous environment that anyone can write code to analyze, even if they can't see the data, because they know what to expect in terms of the rows and columns it has. So what this means, and what this sort of analysis method, analysis results graphic is trying to showcase at the bottom, is that I can write code here at Weill Cornell that analyzes our OMOP data. And if what I find is interesting, I can send it to someone at Stanford, and I can say, hey, can you run this code against your OMOP instance and see if you're getting the same results and see if you're seeing the same phenomenon that I'm seeing here? And they can do that without having to customize any of the code, without having to adjust anything. They don't even necessarily have to go get a data use agreement signed, because they're not sending me any actual patient information. They're just running the code that I wrote and seeing if the aggregate sort of statistical trends that I've observed are replicated in their data. And we could even theoretically, write a paper and publish it together without any data, any actual patient data ever leaving the institution. So this is really cool. And, as a Weill Cornell patient myself, I like the idea of my data never leaving the institution. I'm not, I'm more comfortable with that than I am with the thought of, someone from Stanford getting an Excel spreadsheet with my MRN on it. But it really sort of, I hope you can see how this sort of really opens up the possibilities for people to collaborate, across multiple different sites and centers. And this sort of really narrow, stretched, skinny bubble here is really doing a lot of work. And I'll get into exactly what goes into the process a little bit more in a little bit here. This is essentially what the OMOP Common Data Model looks like visually. It's a bunch of tables. If it's too big to fit into an Excel spreadsheet, but if it were really tiny, you could fit it into an Excel spreadsheet. It would just have a bunch of different tabs. Each one of these is a different table that stores data about a different aspect of the healthcare period or the healthcare process. And all of these tables sort of link together and can be merged together in Python or R or in SQL, which is the technology we use to do the manipulation. All of these tables can be linked together and manipulated to produce sort of final analytic flat files that statisticians can analyze and use to write papers and get papers published. So the person table has like all the demographics, the age, race, ethnicity, sex. Visit occurrence has a row for every time they're seen, whether it's an outpatient visit, inpatient visit, ED, whatever. Drug exposure, all the prescriptions that we wrote for them. If they were an inpatient, all the drugs we gave them while they were in the hospital. Measurement has all the labs. Condition occurrence has all the diagnoses. All of these data have the information, at the level of granularity that it needs to be for that domain. And by linking information together, you can sort of, like I said, build these final analytic flat files that give you what you need. So I'll give a concrete example here. Let's say you're a statistician working on a study, and you need, in order for this study to work, you need to know, two things. One, does the patient, has the patient ever had a hemoglobin over 10? And two, were they admitted in the year, 2000? You could write code that sort of searches both the visit occurrence table and the measurement table, for those conditions, and use that to generate binary variables for each column, yes, no, for hemoglobin over 10 in the range, admitted in the time frame. And you can then bring the results of that query into something like R, Python, SAS, or maybe it's already there, and you can run your analysis and whether it's an ANOVA or a t-test, and you can really sort of get your results. So that's sort of how this works from a data standpoint. It's this relational data model that needs to be sort of stored and housed in a relational database management platform like Microsoft SQL Server or MySQL, one of those. And then people query it to generate the final sort of flat files that they need to do their analysis. So like I said earlier, we sort of bring data in from all these disparate sources and we load it into this OMOP format. And then we send it downstream to any number of these sort of exciting technologies on the right here. And I'll get into all of those in a little bit more detail. But I want to stop and talk a little bit more about this central red cylinder and this sort of transformation, because this process from a technical standpoint is really demanding. There's a lot of work that goes into it and a whole host of scripts that sort of need to happen and need to function together in an intricate ballet in order for this process to go off without a hitch. So I've tried here to sort of talk a little bit about the three of the major components that need to happen in order for this process to go off. In IT, a lot of times we refer to these processes as an ETL. ETL stands for extract, transform, and load. So that's really what we're doing. We're extracting the data from the source systems, from Epic, from Allscripts, from Cerner. We're transforming it into this format, and then we're loading it into a new database so that instead of having the old rows and columns and column names and whatever, it has the new column names and values. So what has to happen in order for that to take place? So under the hood, there are sort of two major things, and there's a lot more in addition to these two. These are sort of two of the biggest things that have to happen in order for this transformation to go off without a hitch. One is encounter mapping, and this is sort of devilishly complicated. And there are some folks in our team who have really done a lot of work mapping this out and thinking about this holistically, and it's really sort of tricky and complex. We have a lot of historical data from a lot of different systems. And sometimes data is represented in more than one of those places. So inpatient encounters are a really good example of this. Before we went live with Epic on the inpatient side at NYP Weill Cornell on 68th Street, we were using a system called Allscripts. But a lot of the data from Allscripts fed over into Epic. So as a clinician, if you were seeing patients, sometimes you would open Epic, in the outpatient setting, and you would see a bunch of labs in the patient's chart without any visit really corresponding to them. That would be because the patient was admitted to the hospital, a bunch of labs were ordered, all of those labs would come into Epic and get filed into Epic because the NYP lab was configured to send a message. But there wouldn't be any Epic encounter to store them under. So we have to figure out all of those problems. And that's just one example of the many issues that sort of come about with integrating data from disparate sources. The old operative systems were a nightmare for this. So before we went live for Epic on the inpatient side, again, we were using systems like CompuRecord and OR Manager to track things like intraoperative anesthesia, stuff about how the OR was run. This is before we were using Epic's OpTime module to track this, and linking that data back to allow people to answer research questions like, how many patients had, an appendectomy where they lost more than 200 milliliters of blood, who had diagnosis X as opposed to diagnosis Y. Integrating that data is really challenging. So we need to link those together to avoid either duplicating data or sort of failures in referential integrity. And what I mean by that is issues where we're not saying that something happened at the same visit that it did, or we're failing to represent the linkage between facts, or the idea that a certain lab happened at a certain encounter. The second thing that has to happen in order for this to go off without a hitch is terminology mapping. And what I mean by this is that it's not enough for us in the OMOP world, it's not enough for us to say, this patient has diabetes. We have to know exactly what kind of diabetes the patient has. And what that means is that you need to load in a SNOMED code. And we can, map the ICD-10. Luckily, Epic does a lot of this under the hood. So as a clinician, when a clinician is entering a diagnosis into Epic, they're picking, a free text item, essentially, that, a really sort of granular diagnosis that's then getting mapped in Epic to an ICD-10 code. We use that ICD-10 code to figure out how to store the data in OMOP. Similarly, for the drugs, we're looking at the RX norm codes. For the labs, we're looking at the Loewen codes. The reason for all of this is to make sure that the questions can be answered the same way at each institution. Because we might describe diabetes one way, we might say, diabetes with no complications. Another site might say, diabetic and stuff. There's all sorts of different ways that you could sort of describe it with free text. And using these reference terminology items lets you make sure that you're asking the same question at each different site. And it lets you make sure that there's some degree of consistency between how the concepts are getting represented. That's really sort of the reason why we have these things like RX norm and Loewen and ICD-10 is to allow us to compare things so that, what we think of as diabetic retinopathy at Weill Cornell is sort of matchable to the same concept at the University of Alabama, or so on and so forth. After doing a lot of the sort of pre-processing work where we map the encounters together, where we map the reference terminology item for each fact in the EHR, we also have to do the actual data load. And this constitutes a whole host of different queries and jobs and scripts that are all sort of sync together to run, each one after the other in a sort of chain series of dependencies. But ultimately, these scripts use the mapping process that's done in the previous two parts of the process to load the data into the new format and to actually create this new person table and this new condition occurrence table, and to actually insert rows of data in and make sure that that all of that happens appropriately. I'm doing a lot of hand waving here. There's a lot that happens that doesn't make its way into these three bullets. For example, QA. We also have to go in and after we've done this and look at the data to make sure that it makes sense. When we just refresh the data, do we now have more labs than we did before? Or do we have less? But also the sort of more like subtle and nuanced questions of data quality. Are all the facts that we're sort of representing as having happened to patients actually borne out by what you see in the front end of the EHR? And a lot of times what we end up doing is going into the front end of Epic to really sort of check and see, okay, according to OMOP, this patient had a hemoglobin of 11.4 on March 13th. Let's go in Epic and see what their hemoglobin was on March 13th to make sure that it's accurate. So those are just some of the sort of aspects that go into this process. Like I said, it's a sort of a massive effort that takes a lot of work. We run it on a quarterly basis to refresh the OMOP data, and then we send it downstream to any number of places. And this is where it starts to get really, really exciting. So in addition to sort of our local OMOP infrastructure, we send our OMOP data out to any number of sources. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about four of them in particular today. One is NCC, or N3C, the National COVID Cohort Collaborative. One is the All of Us Research Program. One is Trinetics, and the other one is the Insight Clinical Research Network. And for all of these processes, for all of these sort of multi-institutional data sharing initiatives, we're using this infrastructure that I just described to support, to send our data where it is then pooled and sort of merged with other sites who are doing the exact same thing so that people working with these initiatives can run questions that touch on data sets drawn from the entire country. So the first one I'm going to get into a little bit is All of Us, and specifically the All of Us Researcher Workbench. So All of Us is a research study that started again under President Obama as something called the Precision Medicine Initiative. It's since been renamed the All of Us Study. And the idea here, if anyone's familiar with the Framingham study, the idea here was really to sort of do the Framingham Study 2.0. The Framingham Study was a really influential and seminal work in population epidemiology. A lot of what we know now about things like smoking causing heart disease comes from this sort of long-term observation of this one town in Massachusetts called Framingham. So for All of Us, the intent here was really to consent 1 million patients from across the country and to follow them over time and look at their health over time to sort of draw inferences about exposure to different things and the impact of that on long-term health outcomes. So patients who consent to join the All of Us program, freely admit that I'm one of them, consent to give all of their electronic health record data to All of Us, and that's where the OMOP part comes in because we send it to them using OMOP. They also consent to have their blood sort of sampled and drawn and to have their genome sequenced from that blood sample. They also agree to answer surveys about their health and their personal history. And all of the data that comes from this, all of the sequencing data from those samples, all those survey responses, all the EHR data that we send, all gets sent to an environment called the Researcher Workbench, where people can access it and use it to test hypotheses and write papers and publish papers. And people are already doing this today. There are a number of studies, I've reviewed a few of them, that use the All of Us data to sort of ask and answer really interesting questions about population level health trends in the US. And this is what I have on screen now shows sort of some of what's available out there to folks. This repeating GIF also sort of shows a little bit about what the platform looks like. This is a web hosted platform. Cornell doesn't host this, NIH does. But folks can make requests. If you have IRB approval, you can get access to data. And you can start running queries and running code in this All of Us Researcher Workbench that analyzes data. And that'll include data from all the All of Us participants across the country. And the EHR data that you're going to have access to there is going to include our EHR data from here at Weill Cornell that our group sends to the All of Us consortium. So that's sort of one of these aspects. And the All of Us program is a really cool one. There's a lot of really exciting work happening here and a lot of potential because again, they're not quite at 1 million patients yet. I think COVID really sort of put a damper in their consent plans and their ability to hit that target number. But there is a wealth of information here for a lot of different patients. And they really tried to sort of oversample patients from underserved populations so that we can do a better job of making sure that our analyses are sort of faithful to the true sort of spread of the population, demographically speaking. This is a really cool resource. I really encourage folks who are interested. It's great for student projects in particular, because there is a sort of a tier of access to the data that's completely de-identified, where you don't have to actually worry about getting a HIPAA waiver for your local IRB. Significantly easier to work with. So this is one source. Again, this here is only for patients who have consented to join the All of Us research program. So that may be, a different body from the group you're looking to assess. It's just sort of worth keeping in mind when you're considering this as a potential data source for a study. N3C is another initiative that's somewhat similar in a lot of ways. N3C, however, is specifically designed to focus on COVID. N3C was sort of spun up in the COVID times when people realized that we have this technology of OMOP where we know how to sort of pool and share EHR data and make it all harmonized. Let's use it to try and address COVID. So we and a number of other sites across the country started sending our data regularly to this national sort of COVID cohort collaborative for all COVID patients. And here we used a HIPAA waiver and a waiver of informed consent to just start sending our data out to this center. So very similar to what I just described with the All of Us Researcher Workbench. The N3C Data Enclave is a tool that actually uses a software provided by a company called Palantir to theoretically securely manage and store the data. And just like with the ALU Researcher Workbench, you can log into this Palantir hosted data enclave, and you can start writing a Jupyter notebook that references the data that's available to you in the enclave. And for this, there's no sequencing data, there's no surveys. It's really just the raw electronic health record data that all the sites send using OMOP, and that it's available to you in that OMOP format. So for someone who's like willing to get their hands dirty and sort of learn a little bit more about this structure that I was showcasing earlier on this slide, N3C is a really, really powerful resource for asking and answering questions about COVID in particular, because you can use the data from these tables to ask and answer all sorts of really powerful questions about exposure to certain medications, about certain lab tests and their relationship to long-term outcomes like length of stay, 30-day readmission, death, so on, so intubation, so on and so forth. So N3C, again, a really sort of powerful resource for this. N3C uses a sort of well-validated phenotype for inclusion. It's really looking at people who had, likely had COVID or, were tested for COVID based on a number of COVID testing codes that they've validated against all of their sort of source data from the different sites. And we participated in the initial conversations about launching this tool, and participating in it has been a real sort of benefit to the community, and we're really glad to have been able to support by sending our data on forward. So TriNetX is the next group I want to talk about here, and TriNetX, is a really interesting use case. TriNetX is a private company, and what TriNetX does is they specialize in supporting accrual to clinical trials. And, I mentioned earlier some of the issues with clinical trials, talking about how expensive they are, in keeping with my spirit of today of bashing on clinical trials. I'm kidding, they're great. One of the other problems with them is that it can be really, really hard to find patients who are eligible. A lot of times clinical trials will be sort of written up in such a way that the inclusion criteria and the exclusion criteria are pretty complicated, and it can be really hard to find people who are eligible. And this is an ongoing issue because people spend a lot of time and money sort of starting a study, and then they'll open it up and they'll find that no one's enrolling. And a clinical trial with no patients is a very sad clinical trial. So TriNetX is one of the ways that we try and support, address this problem here at Weill Cornell by sending our data to this company, sending our fully anonymized and de-identified data to this company, TriNetX, which then sort of allows people to search it. And the data actually, it's pretty clever. The data never actually leave our institution, but using OMOP, they're able to send these distributed queries that say essentially how many patients meet criteria X, Y, and Z. And then the users of the TriNetX network can get back an answer that says there are 48 patients at Stanford, 206 at Weill Cornell, 58 at NYU, et cetera. And they can use this TriNetX platform to send a very nice note saying, hey, healthcare organization, Weill Cornell Medicine, NYU, et cetera, looks like you have patients who may be eligible for this trial we'd like to run. Do you have any interest in becoming a site for the trial? So this is really sort of a win-win. The companies that are looking to launch these trials, they find their patients, we get the trials, which are associated with some revenue, and TriNetX gets a fee from the companies that do it. So using this technology, we can really sort of support that. And we've been able to bring a lot of really sort of exciting clinical trial opportunities to Weill Cornell patients, and in part because of this. There's been a few hundred of these requests from pharma companies coming in to the Joint Clinical Trials Office saying, hey, here's all these really cool studies that we wouldn't have found out about without the use of this TriNetX platform. So this is how we do this. We essentially host a sort of an anonymized instance of this on our servers, and we give permission to the company to sort of run these queries against that data. That assesses, how many patients for study X, how many patients for study Y, and then the only thing that leaves our network and goes back to the company is just the count of patients who are potentially eligible. So they'll only learn, there are 50 patients, there are 308 patients, whereas all of the local data stays on our side. And I see a comment in the chat here from David about this sounds similar to Atlas from Odyssey. And it really is in a lot of ways. One of the main differences here is that this user interface is a lot simpler and more straightforward, and it's much easier to build a cohort in Trinetics than it is to do so in Atlas or using some of the Odyssey inbuilt tools. So that said, the rest of the talk, also just to talk really quick about Insight, I know I'm running out of time here. The Insight Network is the other entity that I brought up earlier. The Insight Network doesn't have a nice screenshot I can show you because they don't provide sort of public access to the data, because the Insight Network consists of a group of New York City-based academic medical centers who pool their OMOP data and make it available to researchers who want to do studies using the direct data. So in that case, the access method is a little less sort of log into this web portal and more make a project request and we'll send you a data set. There's also all sorts of other things you can do with OMOP locally. You can run direct SQL queries. You can connect using R or Python if you're particularly savvy setting up connections to those using the SQL environment. There's all sorts of exploration you can do. There are a number of web applications that the Odyssey Consortium has built that can be sort of stood up on top of this and used to sort of ask and answer questions. There's a lot more, and a good chunk of the rest of this talk usually dives into some of the local stuff. But looking at the time that we have available to us now, I want to stop here and really sort of draw the focus in less on what you can do with OMOP locally, and more on what we can, on the support that it provides for these multi-institutional data sharing initiatives. So I'll stop there at 12:41 with hopefully a few minutes for questions anyone may want to ask about how we support these multi-institutional data sharing networks and how you can use them, or really anything at all. So I see one question in the chat from Dr. Mossadegh about Odyssey images versus, So it's a really good question. So the question here is, are you able to process images using Odyssey, or does it only process tabular data? And the short answer is it only processes tabular data. Going back to the slide earlier about the format here, each one of these is sort of expecting rows and columns data to fit in there. So something like an MRI or a CT scan or a scan pathology slide is not going to fit, into a row and column of data. That said, what can make its way into the OMOP database is the sort of features derived from analysis of those images. So let's say, you were running a machine learning pipeline that was looking at CT scans and trying to annotate which one of them showed evidence of pleural effusion or ground glass opacity. You could run that pipeline and then insert into the OMOP database, maybe a measurement or observation, codes that refer to the concept of pleural effusion as detected by machine vision, or so on and so forth. So not directly, but you can store the sort of results of downstream analysis. David, another great question here. How do you ensure data privacy and security when sharing data between multiple institutions? And OMOP, the beauty of OMOP is that it makes it really easy to do that. So if the request we're getting is not to share a data set, but instead to just run analysis, our group within ITS, the Arch team, sort of acts as the honest broker, and we would be the ones then to sort of run the code and then verify that what we're sending back to the other institution is really just the aggregate results of the analysis. In other words, we're not sending anyone's PHI, we're not sending anyone's MRNs or dates of service or hair color or notes. All we're sending is the results of a t-test. It's like a p-value, or the AUC for how well a model was fitted, stuff like that. So when we're sort of sharing those aggregate results of analysis between sites, there isn't really a PHI concern. There's no DUA that needs to be signed. Sometimes there is data that needs to be sort of shared. And here, as for all of what I described earlier, N3C, Insight Trinetics, we had to sort of work with the Cornell IRB to get HIPAA waivers, waivers of informed consent in place. And we had to sort of work with these sites to ensure that the data that we're sending them is what we're allowed to send. And in some cases, we do have to send PHI. Like for COVID, we had to send PHI because dates are PHI. And we had to know when people were getting treated in order to assess the impact of things like the availability of the vaccine or the availability of Paxlovid. So in cases like that, we're really sending the minimum necessary PHI elements. And again, we're getting local IRB approval to make sure that we're doing that in a fashion that's consistent with institutional guidelines on sharing PHI. So the long and short of it is we only do it when we absolutely have to, and when we do it, we get it covered by the IRB, and we run it by security. We sort of engage in the whole process to ensure that everything that's happening is in keeping with institutional guidance. Are there any further questions? Cool. Well, by my reckoning, that puts us right on the dot of 12:45. Vanessa,
I was going to say, perfect timing today, Evan.
awesome.
Well, thank you so much. If any of you do have questions later on, if you think of something, again, for those who came in late, I will be sending a follow-up email with a recording of this session, as well as some of the links that Evan included in this presentation. I'll probably also just attach a copy of the presentation as well, so you can review everything. So if you do have a question, please feel free just to reply to the email. I'll copy Evan on it. And feel free to ask there. We're happy to help. But thank you so much, everyone, for taking the time to learn more about our services. And a big thank you to Evan for facilitating today's session. Thank you all, and have a good rest of the day.
Thanks so much, everyone, for coming.